Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Immigration Talk Show brought to you by Sakshi TV. My name is Ranjit. We are here today with the attorney Prashanthi Reddy today to discuss the latest updates on immigration, including the latest updates from DOL and USCIS, impact of elections on the immigration, frequently asked questions on adjustment of filing, and Q&A. You can call the numbers displayed on the screen and ask any question related to immigration, and our attorney will be glad to answer. We'll start taking calls in 10 to 15 minutes. I would like to repeat the disclaimer before I start the show. Please note this show is not to provide any legal advice. It is general in nature and it is only for informational purposes. Sakshi TV news and agents are not responsible in any way for your actions. Please use the information at your own risk. Hi Prashanthi Garu, how are you doing?
Hello Andy, how are you Ranjit Garu?
I'm good and it's been long. So before we have few topics today to discuss, let's start with the new H1B wage increase that's implemented by DOL and how is it impacting the people. And I also heard that there is a lawsuit that's going on, and if you have any updates on that, can you please shed some light on it?
Sure, Ranjit. So I thought, because elections are fresh on everyone's mind, and still there is a president-elect. There's not yet a president, but it is, I think, a foregone conclusion that Biden is going to make it as the next president. This is definitely good news, I think, for immigrants or for immigration law, no matter what your political views are otherwise. But from the point of immigration law, especially the way immigration law was suffering under the present administration, under Trump's administration, this is a welcome relief, I think, for all of us, that, it's not about Republican or Democrat, but that we don't have Trump is a big deal for immigration, as I said, no matter what your political views are otherwise. But from the immigration standpoint, clearly there is, it's a big relief, because otherwise the present administration was pretty much set on wiping out H1Bs in whatever way they could. They were trying as hard as possible, short of actually changing the law. And to change the law, they didn't have the majority. So they were doing this through regulation and through executive orders. And as you said, one of that was increasing the fees to make it impossible for entry-level people or even mid-level people to file H1s. Impossible for students to convert from an OPT to a H1. Because they're all entry level, and the wages were so high that also it would lead to lawsuits on equal opportunity, because basically the wages are higher than what the industry standards are, and that's not how DOL wages are supposed to be. You cannot find an arbitrary number that you like and then just put that into the DOL wage. It has to be based on a survey. It has to be based on what wages are in the industry, and then find a median or an average. And then, that's how, DOL wages usually are defined. It's not based on politics. It's based on the market. And that's, unfortunately, they didn't use that. The wages now are higher than wages being paid to other immigrant people or other people who are not on H1. So this leads to lawsuits simply because then the people who are not being paid that wage, because that is not the industry standard wage, can then file a lawsuit against their employer that there is an unequal wage system, that because every employee, based on what their levels are, should be paid the same salary. So this is basically an impossible situation that we're in. So we're hoping with the present, once the present administration takes over, which is in January, it's going to be a difficult road, Ranjit, because nothing will happen immediately. Because one thing is, the executive orders can be. So Trump has changed the law using every tool that he has. So some laws have been changed. For example, the regulation, the one with reference to the wages, which you're talking about, that is where the wage levels have increased dramatically by 35 to 40%. That has been changed via interim final regulation, which pretty much means that it's a quick fix regulation. So they didn't go through the entire regulatory process of publication and then comment period. That will usually takes about 180 days, about 6 months. Instead, they just published it without going through that, because so when you do that, you're open to immediate court cases, which have been filed immediately, and rightfully so, because you have to really show a pressing need for it. If you're filing without going through the process, there is a process for it. It's called an interim file regulation. They used it, but in order to use it, you have to show an immediate need, and they have not shown that need. So that is where we are in court. That's what the lawsuits are about. And there are several lawsuits filed. Basically, the lawsuits have been, what I've heard is with reference to the update on those lawsuits. So there are two regulations that were filed recently. One was with reference to the change in wages, and the other one is with reference to the change in how they define specialty occupation. And the third one, which is, a subset of the second rule, is they're defining how, under what circumstances IT people can work at third-party sites. So with reference to DOL wages, that's completely new. With reference to specialty occupation, that was what they've been implementing. They're basically saying that you don't qualify for a H1 unless you have the job requires a bachelor's in a specific field, and that specific field cannot be 3-4 different fields. It has to be one field. It has to be a single specific field. For example, the systems analyst. And what they do is they go to the publication, which is published by the Labor Department, which is called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And if the Occupational Outlook Handbook says, for example, for systems engineer, it says, which is a specialty occupation, nothing has changed. Thousands of system analyst applications have been approved in the past. Suddenly, what has changed? That interpretation of it has changed. So you cannot have an arbitrary change in interpretation because, you want to do it. It has to be based on some law or some regulation. So the Occupational Outlook Handbook has always said systems analyst requires a bachelor's in computer science or engineering or related fields. So they're taking that part which says or engineering and saying that it's too broad. It is not specific. It doesn't say just computer science. So it's not a specialty occupation. So they've basically declassified more than 80% of the occupations that were previously qualified for a specialty occupation. So that is one way in which they have, depleted the H-1B program. And the second way is, as we discussed, the wages. The wages, the increase in the DOL wages. The wages for a software developer have increased by 21%. In Chicago, increased by 48%. In New York, it was previously 78,000, now it's 116,000. For level 1 I'm talking about. This is the entry level. Entry level IT positions, who gets over 100K? It's just not viable. And that's not what the industry standard is. In LA, it's increased by 36% for a software developer, same position. Level 1 was previously 85,000, which is more attuned to what the industry is. And now they've increased it to 116,000. So you can forget about students coming to the US, because most students come to the US so they can change to a H1 and get some work experience. They will not be able to do that now because companies cannot afford to pay them these wages because they don't make that much money. So they have to make a profit, otherwise they're not going to hire them. So the other thing I talked about is specialty occupation. And the third thing is the working at the client side. So this is with reference to employer-employee relationship, or the right to control your employee if he's working at a third-party site. Now, this is also nothing new. They've been implementing it throughout, but there was an ITserv versus Cessna. There was a court case which ITserv won, where they said invalidated this whole right to control an employer-employee relationship issue. And USCIS stopped using it. But, they were clever because they knew they couldn't win in court. and that they had to implement a regulation, and that's what they're doing. They're not even a full regulation, they're implementing an interim regulation, but its power and its effect is exactly the same as a regular piece of law, and it's going to be effective from December 6th. So that's a huge problem because everything that was bad will come back again. And the other thing they've added to it, not only they've made it worse than it was before. So they're basically saying now that employer-employee relationship, the people who are working at the client sites, they can only get H1s for 1 year. They've restricted it to arbitrarily to 1 year when a H1 is supposed to be for 3 years. So obviously there have been legal challenges. Now the US Chamber of Commerce, along with the National Association of Manufacturers, and then the Alliance on Higher Education, so a lot of universities, University of South Carolina, Cornell, Stanford, they have all filed a complaint with the US District Court in California against both the regulations, the DOL fee hike regulation, as well as the one where they're talking about the specialty occupation and right to control. And the second regulation is the Purdue University, originally filed by Purdue University and the University of Michigan, and then joined by, many organizations are joining this lawsuit, and that's what's been happening since the end of October. A lot of organizations have joined. The Technology Industry Council has joined, and AILA is pretty much spearheading the legal side of it. They're the ones that are filing amicus briefs, basically saying why, explaining why the law is wrong. And they've asked for an injunction. So I believe November 16th is the next date where, we can expect some further information. Right now, they've filed a brief asking for an injunction so that while the lawsuit is being decided, the new law should not be implemented. It should be suspended, the implementation of it, until the court case is actually decided. So that's the first step, to suspend this, because the one with reference to the wages, increase of wages, that is impacting companies immediately because there was an immediate start date. And the one with reference to the other part, which is the right to control and specialty occupation, that's going to impact 60 days later. That is, it came out on October 6th. So from December 7th onwards, that will impact 60 days later, and which is coming up very soon. Before you know it, it's going to be December. So that's when it will be implemented. So it's very important that these lawsuits are successful. Unfortunately, there's, the new administration cannot do anything until they take power. And even after that, if something is in court, then, unless the USCIS concedes that they were wrong and withdraws it and, changes the regulation, which is possible. But with reference to executive orders, it's easy to overturn them. But what we were talking about, the DOL fee increase and the specialty occupation issue and the right to control issue, these are all regulations. So maybe the courts will do it faster than the administration actually can. So let's see what happens. So we're watching and waiting which one happens first, or what happens at all, if the new administration will be willing to do it or not. I think they should be. I mean, because H-1Bs are very, very important for the economy of this country. So, we should wait and watch what happens with reference to that. Ranjit?
Yeah, sure. Before I ask the next question, if the viewers want to reach Attorney Prashanthi Garu for a private consultation, please reach at 212-354-1010 or prashanthi@reddyesq.com. Yeah, we were talking about the DOL implementation of wages, which are about 40% rise compared to the previous ones. Now, I was hearing a lot of news that people started using alternate wage sources for extensions. So how do you think, how effective is that? Is it really going to work?
So luckily, they have not banned the use of alternate wage sources. And that's the first thing that people are looking to. And it's obvious that they will look to that because we're not bound by OES, and it's not necessary for us to use OES, which is basically the wages issued by the Labor Department. So private wage surveys can be used, but there is a certain criteria. As long as they meet that criteria, as long as the survey is done in a certain way and they use median wages and not average wages. So there's a certain statistical rules that have to be implemented in order for the USCIS to accept the wage survey. So right now we have Watson, which apparently does meet those criteria, and we also have another one. So there are 2 or 3 wage surveys which immediately meet that criteria. So people have been using that even before. So that's what we are doing now. We are going forward. That's what we are examining these new wage surveys. Obviously, the wage will be less than what it is with the DOL, because it will be a correct analysis of what the industry wage actually is. They're not going to inflate it because they have no interest in doing that, unlike the DOL. So it's going to be a correct representation, and I think it will be close to whatever the DOL wages were earlier, which were done based on research. So since they use the same parameters, I think it will be similar to what the wages were previously. So yes, we're definitely looking into using those wages.
Okay. On the other hand, what do you think about using the level 1 wages if someone is not comfortable using the alternate wage sources? Is it a good option, or you don't recommend at all, because usually the H1B requires few years of experience?
So I think first look into a private wage survey. That's what my inclination is. And if I can use one of these private wage surveys which have been accepted by USCIS in the past, then I think I would go that route. Just because you always have to follow the safest route to get your client, an approval. You don't want to fight with USCIS. You want to follow the safest route possible. So even though a wage survey might cost a certain amount of money, maybe 600, 400, whatever it is for each survey, I think it might still be worth doing that. But if that is not possible, or the wages are still high, and if the person is entry level, which means that they've just graduated from school, they don't have previous experience, if you're able to show that they're entry level positions, then I would go with level 1, because again, we don't know, because level 1, even though they were sending RFEs when it first came out a few years ago, they actually approved all those cases. They didn't fight or deny those cases, because maybe they were worried that it will not hold up in court. So now, we don't know now if USCIS will change its tune. Now we're only talking, obviously it's a very short period of time. It's, October, November, October is over, but November and December and maybe January. And maybe a few months after that, because, the new government will have other things to look into as well. The most important is COVID, I think, for them. So it will take time for them to even notice and make any changes or give any directions to USCIS as to how to move forward with their cases, and whether they should, and what they should do with RFEs, whether they should send more RFEs. All this is obviously determined at the White House. It's not the USCIS that is actually, there's some brainchild in the White House that is telling the USCIS what to do. So in that circumstances, all this will take time to settle down, but I think hopefully just a question of a few months. So in the interim, I think I would either use a private wage survey, and if that is not possible, if the wages are still too high, then I would use level 1, because in the past, even though they have sent RFEs for level 1s, they have ultimately approved them if we give them the right arguments. So it's not like level 1 is a complete no-no. If you qualify for level 1, we can still use level 1.
Okay. So how about, these are again related to H1B LCAs. Now, how about the PWDs? Are there any alternate wage sources for the PWDs? Because it's
the same thing. So when you say PWDs, that's, for people who don't know, that's prevailing wages that we are filing for green card cases. For the PERM case, we have to file a PWD, and we have to get an approval of a wage before we actually process the case. So they follow the same 4 levels of wages from OES that you follow to file the H1. The only thing is they decide which wage level. In the H1, we decide what the wage level is. But in the prevailing wages, they decide whether it's level 2 or level 3, I guess, based on the educational requirements and number of years of experience. So presumably EB3 will be a lower wage and EB2 will be a higher wage because an advanced degree is needed. So even in a prevailing wage, there's an option to use private wage service, but you have to submit the entire, unlike just filing an LCA and writing the name of the wage, and then maybe submitting the entire background of the survey, if required on an RFE. In a prevailing wage, you have to submit that upfront. So you have to submit the entire survey and the methodology used in the survey, we can make sure that it meets the requirements, and then we can use a private wage survey in short. Okay,
sounds good. So the other thing that recently, happened is the premium fee increase of the H-1B to $2,500. It's already effective. I believe it's for H-1B, I-140, and kind of similar applications. So what do you think about this? This $2,500 is kind of pretty too much. Do you have any thoughts on, about this?
Yeah, the 2,500 is, and they are not, see, the thing is, I wouldn't have had a problem if they provided the service as well as increase the fee. So they should provide additional services for them if they're almost, increase the fee by $1,000. They should provide quick access.
To add to that, actually, as per the bill that's passed in the Senate and House, they said that when you implement this, they have to be a separate system where everything can be tracked and the system is transparent. But USCIS ignored that and they just increased.
They completely ignored, and they also said many other things in the bill. They said that they should start implementing premium processing for H4 EADs and for many other processes. They completely ignored all that as well, and they just used what they thought was most restrictive. Because anyway, H1 premium processing is already there. So they were not really trying to benefit users. It doesn't seem to be a benefits organization anymore, USCIS. It seems to be, an organization that punishes you for filing anything that you file with them. So on that note, that's what they did. They're just implementing the parts of the bill that are detrimental to their users and not implementing the parts which are actually useful and will at the same time give them more money. So it has to be a win-win situation, but they don't see it as that. That's how the present USCIS is. So they have implemented the most detrimental part of it by increasing the fee by $2,000, not providing any extra service. In fact, increasing the number of days. Instead of decreasing the number of days, they've actually increased the number of days and increased the fee. So it's very arbitrary. I don't know, already so many lawsuits have been filed. People are just tired of filing lawsuits, I think, because maybe the present government realized that they might, the outcome of the elections might not be favorable to them. So they also realized that if they pushed in regulations, it'll be much more difficult for the new government to overturn them. That's why there was a push last month for as many regulations as possible, as opposed to issuing executive orders. It's all planned out. This premium processing also is part of that same bigger plan.
Yes. And the other burning issue is adjustment of status filings, and there are a lot of people who are complaining that they have filed in the first week of October and yet to get receipts. And a lot of people didn't get receipts at all. Some people got rejections from the mailroom. So do you have any thoughts and any first-hand experience of if you have got any receipts or any mailroom rejections?
Yeah, we have gotten an indication of only one receipt, which is filed in Phoenix, Texas Service Center, no receipts. So it's taking over a month based on that and what I'm hearing from other attorneys. We have received only one. And based on what I'm hearing from everyone else, it seems to be the same story, which means they're taking more than a month to issue receipts. Cases coming back from the mailroom, unfortunately, there is a no tolerance policy, which is very unfair. At least let them send the cases before November is over. If they send it after November, when the if the visa bulletin goes back, then those people will have no avenues to refile. And, after all, when you're filing such a volume of cases in such a short period of time, mistakes are bound to happen. Everybody's human. And for them to take such a rigid approach is, again, curtailing the immigration system. This is how they do it, by rejecting cases for typos, by rejecting cases sent to wrong addresses, by rejecting because one thing was not tick marked. They're again gaming the system to the detriment of their customers. Again, this is another example of how hard-headed USCIS has become. It's just inhumane at this point. To reject when you know that the person has been waiting for 10 years for the green card and will not be able to refile. And oftentimes you'll be surprised, Ranjit, they will make sure that in cases that are filed, and if there is a deadline, if their I-94 is expired, they will make sure that they wait until the expiry of the I-94 and then they will send the case back. And usually it's a month later or 2 months later. And so the person has no recourse. They cannot refile it. Of course, they will send it in bold letters saying that you can refile it. It is not detrimental to your case. But of course you can't, because they've taken so long. It's just been sitting with them for a month. They've done nothing with it, but they cannot send it back. They will send it back a month later or 2 months later. So, for people who are dealing with USCIS on a day-to-day basis, it's extremely frustrating and heartbreaking in many instances because of their, practices that they follow.
Yep. The other thing is the public charge litigation. The public charge rule, they have, Illinois court has stopped it, and again, people were happy, and within 2 or 3 days, Seventh Circuit again ruled it out. And I don't know what's happening, but, so what's the, situation now, people who have filed, who didn't file in that 2 or 3 days, and later people have to file, what's going to happen? Will the packet be returned, or, how the situation is?
So if it was sent at the time of filing, if there was no requirement for it, then they will not return the package. They will send an RFE asking for the public, the 944 form. But so that was, it's a seesaw of events, right, that took place. First, they started it in February. Then there was an injunction against it. Then they started it again just before October. So we had the bane of our existence during our October filings, because that took the longest time to fill out and to understand and to process. And the supporting documents, there's so many 300 pages of supporting documents just for that public charge form. So it took up half of our time, entire time. It did. 485 doesn't take as much time as that document took. So as soon as the November started again, I guess the court, the lower courts decided that, they should throw it out. And USCIS asked for an injunction while the appeal is pending, but they did not grant the injunction. So everyone was very happy. But then they immediately filed in the higher court, in the appellate court. And then the appellate court immediately granted an injunction. So that's what happened. So it was hardly a few days where we had that relief. So I think as of now, and it has to be watched very carefully. So for those who are filing 485s, make sure you know what the current state of the law is, before you file your case. It's very important because things are changing every day.
And again, the confusion is, how will mailroom determine, there are only a couple of days, I don't know, they may even send the packet back, not knowing that, so these are the things which are uncertain.
So that's a problem. So sometimes the mailroom even rejects cases by mistake. It's not that they're always right when they're rejecting a case. And that is also a huge pain, because when they're rejected by mistake, it's impossible. If the visa number is not available, then they cannot take it back. So no matter whose mistake it is, even if they reject it by mistake, it is still only the person who's filing it that suffers. USCIS doesn't suffer. Nobody else suffers. So that's a big problem. So even if they're rejecting it by mistake, when they're not supposed to be rejecting it, you still cannot file if the visa number is not available.
Yeah, the process is not streamlined properly, and people have to suffer. We heard a lot of cases where proper filings are rejected. Even the proper form attached, they said the form expired. Even the proper check attached, they say that the check is incorrect amount. And even though people attached a copy of the perm, they say that the original perm is needed when the original perm is already submitted, and that a specific field has been checked, saying that obtain a copy from Department of Labor. At
least if they are confused, let them send an RFE rather than rejecting. That's another inhuman way of
Or they could ask their supervisor, who knows it better. That's another way of,
They don't care about doing it. That shows, that only shows the general overall mood at the USCIS and the instructions that they're getting from their superiors, on how to deal with cases.
I think it's again a kind of good news for the people who filed PERMs lately, because I heard that DOL is not anymore sending the original PERMs, and everything is electronic now, and they're only doing it electronically. So this way, even if there is a downgrade or anything such, you just print it out, sign it, and send it, right?
Right. There is no such thing as a blue copy original PERM. But I mean, you can argue that the PERM sent with the original application signed and sent is the original PERM, and anything after that is a copy. So because there can only be one original. So you might
electronic copy, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. So I don't know how they're going to deal with that.
Yeah. I know these are all, the system is complicated. Wish it were very easy, so the overall point is that everyone benefits by the system, but then, as you said, the system...
At least people who deserve to benefit should benefit. People who have been waiting their time, waiting in their queue, following the immigration laws, doing everything by the book, at least they should benefit, right? We're not even talking about amnesty or people forgiven, people who have been illegal, they should be forgiven. Or we're talking about people who have followed the rules throughout their life, throughout their stay in the US.
True. And how do you think, I know this admin was a little bit complicated in terms of legal immigration as well as all the types of immigration. What do you think the impact of the elections on the immigration would be now that the new president-elect takes charge? Do you think this administration would be favorable as it was in Obama administration, where they were the one who implemented the H4 EAD, I-140 EAD under compelling circumstances, and some other AC-21 portability regulations and all? Do you think this is going to be better than what it is now?
Well, as per Biden, because he was criticized during the during the elections, because he was vice president when Obama was president, and during Obama's reign, actually, deportation skyrocketed in the sense that immigration enforcement skyrocketed compared to the previous regimes. So he was actually, and also remember, this whole right to control and all that was not under Trump's administration. It was previously already there, and he just made it worse. So the whole memo was issued during Obama's time. So the idea was that he would go stronger enforcement and then try to get relief by, a bill, which is comprehensive immigration law. That was his idea. But he was able to only implement the enforcement part. And he was never able to implement a comprehensive immigration relief because he never had, Democrats never had majority in both the House and the Senate. So it's going to be the same dilemma now. But Biden has promised that immigration will not be as stringent as it was under even Obama's time. And he has disagreed with Obama's administration. And they did talk about this specifically. I was watching an interview. And he said, but I'm not Obama, so I will not go heavy on enforcement, but it will be fair. So I'm hoping it will be fair. And I'm hoping, all aspects are taken into consideration. And everybody's interests are taken into consideration. I hope the economy is taken into consideration, and that it's a fair and transparent process, which has set rules so that that if a certain person has ABC, the case will get approved. It should not be subject to, again, the interpretation, from the USCIS. Then it becomes very difficult to practice law. It becomes difficult for people to file their cases, because you don't know what the outcome will be. It has to be a uniform outcome for a uniform fact scenario. So there has to be some predictability as well. But as soon as Biden, the results were declared, AILA has sent a document to Biden saying that what the roadmap, his roadmap, their suggestions as to what Biden's roadmap should be for immigration. And basically, I'm just going to read out a few. Basically, he said that AILA has said that first thing is he has to issue a proclamation welcoming immigrants and renouncing anti-immigration bans and policies. So he has to make it clear to everyone that he is pro-immigration and not anti-immigration. And then he has to safeguard our nation's health against COVID-19, but without scapegoating immigrants, by not targeting one particular community or one particular race, or and putting everything on the blame on one community, but doing it in a common sense manner based on science. Third, appoint leaders committed to the administration's vision of reform. So just as Stephen Banner did the opposite, appoint someone who has a fair view of immigration, right? So that they can make clear policies which can then be looked at by the White House. Protect people who are out of status, meaning don't deport them. Don't make them scared to come to the police station and report that, there has been a crime committed against them. That's what's been happening, right? In a lot of Republican states, as soon as you come to the police station, no matter what it's for, if you are out of status, then they will call ICE. And therefore, a lot of illegal aliens don't report the crimes that happen against them. Ensure fairness, efficiency, accountability for all immigration agencies, including the immigration courts. Now, the immigration courts have been severely affected under Trump because the immigration judges have lost most of their independence. A judge has to be independent, right? They have lost that because of various rules that were implemented under the Trump's administration. Reform the legal immigration system and review all employment and family-based applications fairly and efficiently. That's what we were talking about. End the massive incarceration of immigrants by overhauling the detention system. Instead of filling the detention rooms, detention houses, or whatever homes with people who don't need to be there, let them out and put bracelets. Or if they're not harming the society or they're not criminals, let them out and let them go through the regular system. Guarantee legal assistance and counsel for those facing deportation. So you have to have free legal aid. The poor people who are poor, children come in, unaccompanied minors, they don't have counsel. They don't have anyone helping them. So you have to have free legal aid. Ensure all forms of immigration enforcement operating at the border and interior are done in a fair, humane, and prioritized manner. So basically, no more separation of children from their parents, right? That was a huge human rights issue, humanitarian issue, just, horrible. Putting children in cages. So that has to stop. Restore all forms of asylum and humanitarian protection. So under Trump, really, asylum had gone down to 15%. Asylum is usually at 100%, 100 and something thousand under Obama. It went down to 15,000 under Trump. Now Biden has promised that he would bring it up to at least 125 to 150,000. Based on what's happening around the world, people need asylum from different countries because of how difficult the situation is around the world. Also, he has immediately said that he would protect dreamers. Trump has tried over and over again to remove the DREAM Act. And for those of you who don't know, dreamers are those children, undocumented children who have come to the US and fallen out of status for nothing that they have done, for no action that they have done because they were minors when they came in. So that's the Dreamers program. And there is a travel ban against Muslim countries. Many countries such as Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, Venezuela, there's travel bans against them. And, most of the electorate thinks that these travel bans are unfair. So that I think immediately Biden is going to remove. via an executive order, because the travel ban was an executive order. It's easy to remove. The Dreamers is difficult because, again, it has to go through, if it has to be improved to give them some kind of a benefit of citizenship, then I think that is only be possible through legislation. So we should see what happens. With reference to Ranjit, what I was saying about work visas and all these interim regulations that have been stuck in court, nothing can be done with them while they're in court. It's messy unless the government withdraws the regulation, and that could take some time as well. Or they might just decide to wait until the court makes a decision. So executive orders such as, the two executive orders that come to mind which have affected legal immigration the most is the family-based immigration, but that has already been stayed, right? The one that was in August, which basically said that people who are out of the country cannot apply for family-based green cards until December 31st. That's set to expire anyway, December 31st. So the government is still in power, so they can decide to renew it. So then it'll be up to the new government to rescind it. So they'll have to do that through an executive order. But it's already, because of a court case right now, it's already on hold. But there is another one which is talks about non-immigrant visas, right? The ban on non-immigrant, on issuing new non-immigrant visas, H's, L's, to people who are outside the country presently. So that is something that I'm hoping will go away. So we have to wait and see what happens. But obviously the politics are going to drive some of these things, and there are other issues. There are other pressing issues that Biden will have to take care of. So I don't know if he'll have the time or what kind of, if he has a task force for immigration, then it might be easier because then it'll be faster for him to implement this. So let's wait and see. But it can't be worse than it was, that's for sure. It'll only be better. But how long it takes, how quickly it goes back to normal. Now, I'm not saying that normal was good. Normal was not good. It has to improve. But again, it depends on whether he has, what happens at the Senate, whether the Democrats gain a majority in the Senate. That will make a big difference, I think, to the possibility of any new immigration law being implemented.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, again, to pass any comprehensive immigration reform, the CAR, the majority is needed in Senate, because the other side of the party is always against increasing the green card numbers and, increasing legal immigration. So that's a point where, what happens, we have to see. And, as you said,
I've heard, Ranjit, that Biden is for removing per country quotas for green cards.
Yes, it is in their agenda, but then again,
right.
Senate majority is, something
Correct.
That's needed because
they don't have the power to do that unless they do it through an executive order or a regulation again.
Which is not possible again.
Executive which they order won't want to do if it's going to be challenged in court. They will not do it, and so if they don't have the legal grounds to do it, they will not.
But then I heard that a few lawyers again suggested some things that can be done through executive order, like giving EADs to everyone who has an I-140. That's something that could be done through an executive order, and probably I don't know if they are considering it.
Right, I heard about that proposal. That is possible too, because the same way they did H4 EADs, but again, that is again subject to a court case. So everything that they try to do through an executive order, they will think about it before they do it because they don't want to lose in court. So I think some of these things have to be thought out, like the hundreds of refugees.
I would think that there couldn't be much opposition for that I-140 EAD thing. But anyways, let's see, because that's already in place. But except the word that has compelling circumstances, maybe removal of that word would make it easier. And another thing also, they were suggesting something for DACA, giving TPS, temporary protected status.
Right. So also they want to do TPS to many other countries. Some other countries, at least, I think that will be an immediate thing that Biden will do. TPS to Venezuela, maybe, and some other countries that are, affected politically or whatever it might be. in difficult situations. So yeah, TPS is another thing we can expect. That is easy enough to do.
The other challenge is these H1B new rules and DOL and USCIS rules. They are done through rule making process, and even if the new administration want to resend it's again subject to the rule making process that would take about 4 to 6 months or even more. And again, depending on the new admin's priority, they may not pursue it as soon as they are in charge. They might have other things like another stimulus is at top of their head, and COVID control is another thing, and DACA is another thing. So probably they would pursue little later. So we have to see.
And also somebody was saying that it will take another 4 years for them to undo all the things that Trump has done, because there I think are like 100 different regulations or executive orders over the years that he has implemented, which to be undone will take another 4 years. That's what someone was saying. Some political commentator was saying.
Yeah, could be. Yeah, we have to wait. Let's wait and see how it works out. And yeah, the other thing is again the visa bulletin thing. People are saying that president has that power to get everyone current and use the filing dates. That's one thing everyone is saying that could be done. Yeah, but again, we have to wait and see. At least people get relief. Yeah, again, talking about these visa bulletins, October, November, seem to be pretty good, allowing the filing dates, and the dates did not progress as well. The final action dates progressed by, I think, about 2 weeks and 5 weeks, something like that, for EB2 and EB3. What are your predictions for December visa bulletin? Do you think there could be any movement in final action date and also the filing dates, which are not moving at all? So do you have any expectations?
So I think, as per what they've said earlier, the final action dates might still move, especially for EB2. So in the October visa bulletin, the November visa bulletin, basically the final action dates moved. The filing dates didn't move at all. It was the same. At least it didn't retrogress. We are happy about that. But for EB1, for India, we're mainly talking about India because the other worldwide is current. EB1 moved by 6 months, final action date. EB2 moved by 21 days. And EB3 moved by 1.5 months, so 6 weeks. So it's not significant movement, but there is some movement. So I think it'll inch forward until the end of the year. So we can expect in December also that there will be some forward movement until March, I would say, next year. It'll slowly inch forward, but I have no idea whether they will keep the final action, the filing dates as they are present, or they will move back, or I doubt they'll move forward because they have not said that. But I think whoever had to file has already filed with reference to the filing action dates, unless those people who were left out because their labor was not approved, they didn't have an I-140 approval. Therefore they were not able to file the I-140 and 485. So except for those few people, I think most people have filed because they had to file because the November visa bulletin didn't come out until the end of October. So really there was no chance to breathe or, try to decide what to do. So pretty much everyone filed, whoever had to file. So the only change for people would be if the final action dates move significantly or if the filing dates for filing move. I don't think either of those will happen. Final action dates will move a little bit, inch forward, and I don't think dates for filing will move. They might retrogress moving forward, obviously.
Okay, got it. Let's see how it works out. And the other thing, this I-485, a lot of people have a lot of questions, and a couple of questions that were, most of them are asking are, we know that as per the AC-21, you have to stay with the employer for 180 days once you have the I-485 filed, the receipt from the date of receipt. But then a lot of people now, again, the COVID is spiking and people are getting laid off in some instances where, so what happens? Let's assume someone has filed the adjustment of status and they lost the job before the 180 days. So what happens in that case?
So it's not about whether you were laid off or not. It's about whether the employer intends to hire you for the future job, but the job offer is still open or not. And that is a possibility. They could be laying you off temporarily because obviously they don't want to get into trouble with the law. They don't want to pay your wages or put you on bench without wages. So they might be laying you off, but that doesn't mean that the permanent job offer has been rescinded, because it's an offer of employment which they should specifically say is rescinded. It has nothing to do with your job right now. This is a temporary job that you're working. So it's possible that even if you're laid off temporarily, it might not affect your offer of employment. So you might still be able to cross that 6-month period, the 180-day period. And then if there's been no rescinding in the permanent job offer, then after 6 months you can do the AC-21 and move jobs.
Okay, got it. So let's say someone got fired in 3 months and then he moved to another job. So can he not file I-485J after 3 months? So you mean to say that you have to wait until 180 days?
No, you have to wait for 6 months. As per AC-21, after filing of the 485, you're allowed to file the 485J to change employers after 6 months after filing the 485.
Okay. Another situation here, let's say someone has downgraded the I-140 and filed concurrently 485 and everything, and past 180 days, they plan to move to another employer and they file. Now the situation is the downgrade I-140 is not approved yet. In this situation, after 180 days, can someone move to another employer and file I-485J, or they have to wait until the I-140 is approved, because I-140 is linked with the 485 and the current employer could withdraw the I-140?
Right. So I'm trying to remember, but I don't think it says anywhere that the I-140 has to be approved. I can't remember actually. Maybe, right now I can't remember. But I think the main requirement is that the 485 has to be approved. And 6 months after that, you can file. I don't remember that there is an additional requirement that the I-140 has to be approved. In which case, you can conceivably
Sorry to interrupt you, Prashanti. We have a caller. Let's take the call and then we can continue. We have a caller named Sammy from Michigan, I believe. Hi, welcome to the show, and you can ask your question.
Hi, my name is Rami. Actually, my I-140 applied. Have 3 years degree. How is what is the possibilities of approved for 3 years degree?
There's no issue with filing for a 3 years degree. As long as you file it in EB3, you cannot file EB2. So if you have filed an EB2 with a 3 years degree, that's not going to be approved. Because the regulations clearly says that it has to be a 4-year degree. Plus 5 years of experience.
EB3 also not going to have, is there any issue with EB3 if I apply?
No. With EB3, there is no issue at all. You can safely, even without a degree also, you can file EB3.
Yeah, I have applied EB3, my employer, and things I don't know why I got a result denied yesterday, and we filed one more I-140. That is, I don't know what is the exactly reason of the denial. Is there any possibilities? What is the causing that denial?
It could be that, we can only speculate because I don't have the denial. If you read the denial, you should be able to understand what is happening. But it could be that they filed under EB2. If they filed under EB2, if you have a 3-year degree, that is one thing. The other thing is if they have filed under EB3, but they have asked for a bachelor's degree in the PERM as a minimum requirement. Even then it's going to be denied because you don't have a bachelor's degree. You have a 3-year degree, which is not considered to be a bachelor's degree in the US. So they should not ask for a bachelor's degree.
Mm-hmm.
And they should not ask, and they should not file it in EB2. That is
I mean,
how you-
again, Rami, I think we have to, attorney probably have to see the denial because it could be for a number of reasons, could be something else, If you need attorney's
Okay.
advice or consultation, please reach her with the denial copy and probably she would be able to assist you because there could be 100 reasons for the denial. It could be something to do with the employer or it could be some misrepresentation.
It could be ability to pay. It could be anything. Your degree. It could be 100. Yeah.
Yeah. So
it could be anything.
yeah, you should always have the denial in hand and then probably contact your employer or another attorney for for a second advice. But then get the denial and then talk to someone. That's the best way to do because there could be a number of reasons for the denial. Okay, it was nice talking to you, Rami, anyways. And going to, we are almost at the end of the time. So, we are continuing the previous one. So you mean to say that doesn't really matter if I-140 is pending, that they can even move and, just file the 485J, that would do that.
Ranjit, I'm not able to remember that right now, but I can get back to you on it. It's like my brain is not working right now.
Sure. We'll
But I think we can discuss that in the next session. I can confirm that. But I think just from memory that it's sufficient if the 485.
Yeah, but my only logic was, usually when you move, most of the employers don't withdraw the I-140, but then, if they have to withdraw, because I-140, I-485 is based on that I-140, which is, the downgrade. So I was kind of logically, would it be even possible to move to another employer? Because, when I-140 is gone, the whole petition would probably be void. That's what was my
So in situations like that, beyond 6 months, if the I-140 is withdrawn by the employer, it has no effect because after 6 months, they cannot withdraw it, or rather they can withdraw it, but it doesn't presumably affect your green card because the whole I-140 and 485 is being taken over by the new employer. That's the logic. The entire offer of employment is taken up by but the thing, what happens is then if the I-140 is not approved and AC-21 is allowed, even by doing AC-21, if ultimately the I-140 gets denied, then then your 485 will also get denied because you have to have a valid I-140 in order for, you to continue the 485.
Okay. Thanks, Prashanti. I think we are at the end of the show. Thanks for all the calls and watching the show. It was a great session with interesting topics and questions. Please call in every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Now it's 5:30 p.m. EST to watch the Immigration Talk Show. And again, it's every Wednesday, 5:30 p.m. EST and Sakshi TV. This is Ranjit signing off. Thanks, Prashanti. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ranjit.